Hi folks, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about orchestral panning. Let's get straight into it. Okay, so panning an orchestra can be a bit of a mystery, especially if you don't have any kind of orchestral background, if it's not something that you have personal experience with. So where do you start? Well, the simplest place to start is with a picture of an orchestra, right? So we go to Google and we type in orchestral diagram or picture of an orchestra, and it will give you a bunch of options. That's the first thing to note. There isn't necessarily one set of rules for where things are positioned in an orchestra, okay? Depending upon the period of the piece of music that's being performed or the style that you're trying to emulate, be that Baroque or Romantic or 20th century, the actual instruments in an orchestra and their positions can vary. A Baroque orchestra is much smaller than a Romantic orchestra, for example. But let's take a look at some of these images quite crudely. So here's the first image that I click on. And you'll see we've got some color-coded areas. So we've got this sort of orangey color. It says first violins, second violins, violas, cellos, double basses. Now, all of those instruments, those 5 different instruments, are all string instruments. And basically you'll always find the strings at the front of the orchestra, nearest to the audience and nearest to the conductor. Then, behind them, sort of in front of the conductor still, you'll have what's called the woodwind. So these are flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons traditionally. Behind those, you'll have the brass, so French horns, trumpets, trombones, tubas, and the percussion at the back. That's the general rule. You have strings at the front, then woodwind, brass, and percussion. Let's click on some of these other ones kind of randomly and we'll see. Okay, strings at the front, woodwind, brass, percussion. Brass and percussion slightly different offset, but still more or less in the same place. Let's look at the next one. Strings at the front, woodwind, brass, percussion. Okay, next one. Strings at the front, woodwind, brass, percussion. So we've got a pretty clear consensus. Strings at the front, woodwind, brass, there or thereabouts, percussion. An important question to ask ourselves is, why have those specific instruments been put in those specific places, first and foremost? And secondly, why are there many more of one thing than there are of another? Let me grab, I reckon this one is the clearest to look at. So you'll see very, very clearly that the strings are by far the largest section in the orchestra. We've got first violins, second violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. So we've got 5 different string instruments and a lot of numbers in each. Why is it that that section is at the front? So they're clearly prioritized, and there's more of them than there are of, say, flutes, clarinets, oboes, the woodwind, etc., and more of them than there are of the brass and of the percussion. Well, the answer's pretty clear, actually. It's to do with the sound, the timbre of those instruments and how that sound projects. The reason that the percussion and the brass are at the back is because they're loud, generally speaking. Yes, you can play them quietly, but generally they're loud and their sounds project clearly. So they're put at the back so that the quieter things and the things that don't cut so easily are in front of them. So woodwind traditionally have a slightly more brittle timbre, a reedy sound, because they have reeds in them. They have this real vibrating kind of sound, and they cut less than the brass, but a bit more than the strings. So they go in between the two. The strings, conversely, they tend to have this kind of lush, smooth, very lyrical tone, and there's a lot of them in order to help that sound multiply and give it some more richness and fullness in order to balance with the other timbres within the orchestra that are much more potent, that can cut through much more easily. So this layout that you have in an orchestra is not a coincidence, it's not a fluke, it's something that has evolved over many, many years as the orchestra has grown and as the roles of different instruments within an orchestra has developed. And this sort of scheme, this layout, if you like, of the orchestra has very good reasons behind it. So What does that help us to understand? Well, if you are looking to pan an orchestra within your session, if you're writing an orchestral section or something that's much fuller, if you don't know where to start with where everybody starts. And if you want to change anything, think about a reason why you would need to change something. This has been working for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's not broken, so you don't need to fix it. If you want to move something, you should have a reason for wanting to move it. With that said, let's get into our DAW and let's take a look at how some orchestral instruments might be presented to us. Now, I have got a bunch of stuff by Spitfire Audio here. So I've got up in front of me Spitfire Audio's symphonic strings, 5 sections, violins 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now the MIDI that I've got here is very, very crude. I just downloaded a MIDI file off the internet and chucked it in here to give us something to listen to, but please by no means judge my MIDI programming. This is not my MIDI, it's just to give us something to listen to, okay? But the first thing we need to do is learn kind of intimately what we have to work with within our instrument. Now, all MIDI instruments will be different dependent upon the company that's made the instrument. Spitfire Audio present theirs in this kind of way, but you might have something by Native Instruments or whoever else, and it'll be presented in a different way. So you need to first of all learn how your instrument is laid out in order to know the options and flexibilities that you've got within that instrument. I say that because probably within your instrument, you will have the ability to adjust characteristics of that instrument in terms of its position on a stage, on a stereo field, or its reverb, or its distance from the audience, or all number of things. So here is our violins 1 interface, and the first thing that we're presented with is this easy mix option and the ability to move the audience closer or further away from the orchestra. You can see our little orchestral map here, and you can see that we're moving the audience closer or further away. Now, what is that actually doing to the sound? In order to understand that, in fact, let's just listen to that. Let's listen to it really close. So we're as close as we can go with the audience. And if you've guessed the track already, it's Eleanor Rigby. And let's hear that again, but now the opposite, as far away as it can go. Now that's very interesting. Why? Well, the close sound gave us a much more focused sound in our stereo image. When we were in close, the sound of those first violins was very much over to the left-hand side, if we go back to our orchestral map, where we would expect them to be, over here. And we can see that clearly being indicated on our meters here, very much predominantly on the left-hand channel. But if we go to the full far option, ever so slightly weighted still to the left, but much more of a full stereo image. So what's going on there? In order to figure that out with this instrument, we need to look under the hood. So I'm going to click this little spanner icon here, and then you can see we've got this mic mix. I've got a C, a T, and an A. So in this instance, the C is close mics. So that's microphones very close to those instruments. The T is what's called a tree, which would be a microphone configuration that's more or less above the conductor's head, sort of behind the conductor's head. And then the A would be ambience, so that's the full room ambience. We have the option within this instrument to blend those different microphones. So in the close position, as we are, we're just getting the close mics. If we go back to the far position though, you'll see now that we swapped to just the ambience. So now we're getting the whole room ambience. What that's telling us is there's already panning information within the recording of this sampled instrument that we can play with. So let's say we want quite a defined sound within the stereo field, we can adjust the level of this microphone manually. So let's go with, I don't know, 80%. Maybe we only want a tiny little bit of the natural room ambience and a little bit more of the tree behind the conductor. Okay, that's very interesting. So I'm able to create a bit of a blend according to the style of sound that I want. Let's say that I wanted to go with a more roomy sort of overall ambient sound. I could, adjust these levels. So let's go with much less of the close and more of the tree and ambience. And I have the option to do that within my instrument. Now, of course, your instrument will be different or could be different to this instrument, but you will have some option, some flexibility within that instrument, most likely, to adjust how that thing is positioned and placed in the stereo field. So just by utilizing the information that's already in the instrument, you can already build a pretty realistic picture of how things should be placed. Now, let's take this to the extreme in both instances. Let's say that I want to put up just the close mics of all of these instruments that I've got playing at this point. I actually haven't got any double basses in this section, so I'm not going to bother dealing with those. But this is just the very close mics, and you should hear very distinct positions in the stereo image for each of these four parts. So if we solo those one at a time, we know where the first violins are. Now, interesting that our second violins feel to be a bit more sort of there, a bit more to the right-hand side. That's interesting because that isn't necessarily where we'd expect them to be. We might expect them to be more kind of to the left-hand side. Let's see where our violas are. Okay, they're where I would expect them to be. And our celli? Again, they're where I would expect them to be. So, what can we do about the abnormality of our second violins then? Because they're not where I think they should be. The answer is that I could pan them, of course. So I need to get a stereo pan pot up here in order to be able to move their whole stereo image. And I'm going to move them until I think they're in the position that I want them to be. And whilst I'm at it, I think I want the celli to be a little further to the right. So I'm able to look at the information that's there in front of me, listen to it, and then adjust according to what I'm hearing. So you've got to use your eyes and use your ears, of course. Now, in terms of building the ambience and a cohesive ambience of these instruments, I've got two options. Either I can use the ambience and the trees that are built within the instruments. So let's just build that in quickly and crudely without too much science. So now, because I know that all these instruments have been recorded in the same place at the same time, I'm going to get an ambience that's going to tie them all together. So this should sound less close and more ambient, but still with that kind of focus and attention that we're getting from those close mics. So that's option one. You can use the ambience and the reverb within your instrument in order to situate those things a little better. Option number two is that you could, if you wanted to, create either a reverb on your actual track or a reverb send, and send these things all to one reverb auxiliary, which would then tie them together all in one location as well. Personally, I like to use the one that's built into the instrument because that's the location of the recording of these instruments. But neither is right or wrong necessarily, and there are reasons why you do it either way. Now, the next question that we come on to then is, if we've got panning information built into the instruments, what about depth? How do we create depth? Because of course, if we look at our orchestra here, it's not just left and right that we need to think about. It's, the distance away from the listener. So how do we conjugate that within this situation? For example, if I go to these brass instruments here, which are exactly the same part. Okay, exactly the same parts. How do I create a feeling of depth? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. What I can do is to adjust the balance of my different microphones. So rather than having, up to 80% on the close mics, I might be at, let's say, 40% on the close mics, and then I might be up at, 60% on the ambient, and maybe, 50% on the tree. And in that way, I'm going to be getting some further distance. I'm going to get a less defined location in the stereo image because I'm using less of the close microphone than I was with the strings, where I wanted to kind of clearly locate something in its specific position. So let's just dial in something. Okay, as opposed to if I was going in, the full close tight option, which I could use if I wanted, again, to clearly define a place. Let's just quickly dial these things all back in. Worlds apart, obviously in terms of sound, but also in terms of the overall feeling that you get. So if you're looking to create depth as well as a left-right image, look at the blend that you've got within your instrument. Of course, if you haven't got these options within your instrument, maybe your instrument is in mono. So let's take that as an example. Let's say we've only got these 4 instruments in mono. Let's make all of these things hypothetically in mono. So in this instance, I'm just going to do it by pulling up a directional mixer and making it completely mono. Okay, so we're imagining everything straight up the center. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at my orchestral map. I'm going to say, right, where do I want my French horns to be? Okay, I want them to be in the center. Maybe I don't like the position that they are in this image. Maybe I'll look at a different option. Maybe I'll look at this option. Okay, French horns to the left-hand side-ish. Right, I'm going to narrow this stereo image and put my French horns there or thereabouts. And then I'm going to use my directional mixer and open it back up. Because I've narrowed the image there, I don't need the directional mixer here. Okay, then I've got trumpets in the kind of middle section. So let's define my trumpets just straight there, straight down the center. Let's narrow these French horns a little more. Trombones are to the right-hand side of the trumpets. Okay, let's take my trombones and put them over here. Let's make these things narrower still. Let's take those, and then I can turn these off. And my tuba, okay, my tuba's a fair way out to the right-hand side. Let's go over here and let's take a listen. Okay, that works. And then what if I wanted to make those feel a little bit more ambient and less, brutal, crude? Let's just pull up a reverb. Let's go with a large hall, and let's adjust this dry-wet blend to taste. Okay, so there's another option for you. If you haven't got the flexibility within the instrument to adjust any microphone balancing or any position in the stereo field, there are ways that you can do it externally with a directional mixer or with your pan pots and with reverbs. Now, the other consideration that you need to think about is the style of instrumentation that you're using. The two instrument sets that we've listened to just then are Spitfire Audio's symphonic brass, so they're big symphony orchestral sections. But what about if I wanted a smaller chamber orchestra or a chamber group? Chamber orchestras are much smaller. They don't have these great big swathes of string sections. If I look up chamber strings, for example, the image that I'll get will be of, what do I got? Maybe 8 first violins. I believe the second violins are over on the right-hand side. This time, violas could be here or could be either side of the cello and the basses at the back. So I've got a different setup here. So let's listen to this chamber group. So straight away we can hear that we've got a smaller ensemble sound because it's a chamber group. So, if we go with the similar mic blend, even so with the smaller chamber group, it's going to give us a different feel. The question is though, have I got different panning information on the violin sections? Okay, first violin's very much over that side. Second violin's over to the right. And the viola's pretty much down the center. So yeah, we have got different panning information built in to these instruments, as you would expect, because it's a chamber group. We've got instrumental positioning and a blend of sounds, a kind of a room sound that is more appropriate for a chamber orchestra. So let's just pull up the same blend that we had for our symphonic orchestra. Obviously worlds apart from, this lusciousness. So we might say, actually, you know what? That's not enough room sound for what I want. I want a bit more roomy vibe. So I can go and adjust these microphones. Let's put the chamber group back on here. A little bit more vibey. So you've got to consider as well what it is that you're actually working with. Are you working with a big symphony sound? Are you working with a smaller ensemble? And moving on from that point, we can start thinking about, okay, what if I'm not doing a full orchestra? What if I've just got 1 or 2 violins? Or what if I've just got a trumpet and a saxophone, or just one instrumental feature? Well, at that point, you're then moving away from the whole working with an orchestral section. You're then just thinking about one sound, and you can go back to all of the other rules and techniques that you've learned about positioning things within your stereo field, finding a pocket, finding a space for it to be positioned, pairing it up or balancing it with something else so that you're not making your mix too one-sided. All those kind of basic things that help you keep a balanced stereo image. So information is key. First and foremost, you need to know your instrument. You need to learn what capabilities you have within your instrument. And then you need to think about purpose. What are you trying to achieve with the parts that you've got? Is it a full symphonic thing? Is it a smaller chamber thing? Is it a trio or a quintet? Or is it just 1 or 2 instruments that you can just position wherever works in your stereo image? Information is key. So that's me just about wrapped up on this section on panning. In my next video, we're going to be getting into the really meaty stuff, and we're going to be starting to look at EQ, learning absolutely everything that is fundamental in our knowledge of EQ, how to EQ, different sorts of equalizer, and all the good stuff. So I'll see you in the next one.